G'day mate, 40 here. So I got up this morning just after 4 a.m, had to be all limber and ready to watch the United States tackle Iran to get into the knockout stage in the World Cup, which started at 6 a.m. Sydney time. And when I logged on, I checked Twitter, I saw that Colin Dell had said, sometimes I think Luke Ford is the last sane man on the internet, and then I remember he's an Aussie bro LARPing as a Jew. Thought that's a nice thing to say. And then I thought, a lot of people are reasonably sane, perhaps in part because they have a large segment of their life that is non-rational, right? Man does not live on reason alone. Nationalism is largely a state of mind. It's not necessarily the most rational thing, but it's a bond that you feel with members of your nation. And scholars of nationalism often say that nationalism can be best understood by looking at songs, looking at poetry, looking at effusions of emotion, rather than rational theses. And so too, the best marriages I've noticed, people tend to have highly irrational views of their spouse. Right? They believe that their wife of 50 years is the most beautiful woman in the world. And I've seen the scientific surveys that, having a vast overestimation of the value and worth of your spouse is one of the predictors for a lasting marriage. And I think about the enormous emotion that I get from being a supporter of the Dallas Cowboys, Los Angeles Dodgers, or the American soccer team, or the Australian cricket team. Right? That's non-rational. There's no reason that I should give a toss about what these professional athletes do, but it moves me emotionally. When Tony Romo, an undrafted free agent, became the starting quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys, right? That was moving to me, and that's non-rational, even irrational, that I should be so emotionally affected by Tony Romo. So I think for a lot of us, that we benefit from having a substantial portion of our life that is irrational. It's non-rational. So it makes life a little more magical and enchanted. Like when you see more to reality than is really there. Now, of course, this can get you into trouble. So I'm talking about using these things in an adaptive way. But a lot of religious faith is non-rational, even irrational. National feelings, sporting feelings, having a vast overestimation of the relative value or qualities of your spouse. Frequently non-rational, even irrational. So I think some of us need room to play, even to LARP, and to indulge in the non-rational and the irrational. And then that then facilitates being rational in other areas of your life. So, for example, you may not want to study music critically, you may just want to enjoy music. So some people, when they break down the notes and they study music critically, or they study poetry critically, or they study the Bible critically, it removes the enjoyment. And so many people find the Bible more enjoyable, more emotional experience. They believe that every word came from God. Many people get more enjoyment from music if they don't critically analyze it, or from movies, or from TV, or from novels. Like Sam Bankman-Fried talked about how he never read books, that he thought anyone who had written a book was a loser because he could probably have summed up the point of his book in a 6-paragraph blog post. But the journey through a book is the point, not necessarily the upshot. It's not necessarily the destination. It's the pleasure that you get along the journey. And we need pleasure in life. We need joy in life. And that frequently comes from the non-rational and the irrational. And for example, I'm not taking bus 374, which is the fastest way to get where I want to go. I like taking light rail, even though it's going to delay me 20-30 minutes. I just like the slow, pleasant light rail journey rocking me back and forth. I'm not in any rush. About 12:40 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon here in Sydney. Then I'm just going to irrationally, non-rationally, and rationally make my way to Circular Quay next to the Sydney Opera House. Then maybe I'll take a ferry to Parramatta. And I intend to enjoy the journey. It's not just about getting to Parramatta. In fact, there's nothing in Parramatta of which I'm aware of that I want to see. I just want to enjoy what I believe is the longest ferry ride in the Sydney ferries. A nice leisurely 30-minute jaunt up to the Parramatta River. So, just because someone may be LARPing in one area of their life, and I don't accept that I'm LARPing as a Jew. Conversion to Orthodox Judaism is very demanding, and it remains an integral part of my life for way more than 20 years now. Most of my friends are Orthodox Jews. I spend most of my social time with Orthodox Jews and Orthodox institutions, doing Orthodox rituals, participating in Orthodox study of Torah, having meals with Orthodox Jews. Right, it's a high intensity, high demand religion. It's not something that you can just LARP at. Right? You spend so much time in synagogue, so much time around other Orthodox Jews, that if it was just a LARP for you, people would just see through it in a second. But even if you do have things that you LARP at, doesn't mean that the rest of your life can't be serious and effective and rational and clear. There's a time for love and a time for hate. There's a time for reason and a time for non-reason. There's a time for love, joy, peace. There's a time for anxiety and fear and revenge. For everything there is a season and a purpose under heaven. So there are all these little places in Sydney where you're in the middle of the city and then suddenly you go down some stairs like over here and you just descend into some kind of lush tropical paradise. G'day mate, 40 here. We're on the ferry to Parramatta, leaving Sydney Harbour behind, the Sydney Opera House. Anyway, I was just listening to Robert Wright interview with Eric Alterman, the left-wing 25-year Nation magazine media columnist, a PhD in history, a professor of English and journalism. And he was talking about how the United States is not a democracy, it's an oligopoly. And maybe you didn't hear, but Putin's Russia is not a proper democracy. Maybe you heard that China is a dictatorship. But many nations are a combination. In fact, all nation states are a combination of different forms of government. So the United States has elements of democracy. It has elements of oligopoly. It has elements of dictatorship. It probably has elements of aristocracy. It has all sorts of different elements. So it's not like it's either a democracy or an oligopoly or a dictatorship. It's all three. Like when it comes to foreign policy, the United States president is essentially a dictator. He has all the rights of King George III. Joe Biden has said 3 times the United States would militarily intervene if China tries to take Taiwan. No, most Americans don't support the shedding of American life to save Taiwan, but the foreign policy elites have already made this decision. The people don't get a vote on this. The people of the United Kingdom were very opposed to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But England joined the fight nonetheless, because Tony Blair and the Labour government decided it. Australian people were not supportive of Australia joining the wars against Afghanistan and Iraq, but Australia's elites made that decision, and so that's how it is, right? So the element of democracy doesn't really decide Australia's foreign policy. There's just elements of democracy in foreign policy, and there are elements of oligopoly, and there are elements of dictatorship. So too with Israel. Is Israel an apartheid state? Well, there are elements of the Israeli state and its occupation of the West Bank you could rightly call, similar to apartheid, and there are elements that are not. Does England have free speech? Right? England has considerably less free speech than the United States, but more than Russia. So, just like people aren't honest, good, righteous, true, they're only honest, good, righteous, true in certain situations, and they're less honest, less righteous, less true, less fair dinkum, less kind in other situations. So too with nations. In certain situations, there'll be dictatorships, such as foreign policy crises. President Dwight Eisenhower said the United States would only survive nuclear war if it was operated as a dictatorship. So in times of crisis, dictatorial elements come to fore in a nation state. Other times, democratic elements or oligopolistic elements come to the fore. Depends on the situation. The people aren't one thing. G'day, mate. 40 here. I was just listening to Peter Zion on the Ukraine war. He talked about how Russia's invasion was imperialist, circular quay, fascist, in the Opera House, and genocidal. Just want to take the longest ferry ride possible. I don't think any of those descriptors are accurate. $5 American at most. I don't really think they shed important light on things. Talking about this Nick Fuentes meeting with Donald Trump. And Mitch McConnell says, there may be tiny elements of imperialism. I don't really see any. You'll never be president of the United States. No, there are no elements of imperialism. There are no elements. A lot of people have anti-Jewish feelings. And to the extent that there is a genocide, then genocide is such a hotly contested definitional controversy. that professors who specialize in genocide have fallen out with each other and stopped speaking to each other. Right? Is that highly contested?
Very few. I think Fuentes, may well be what he says. Someone who's pro-Christian. So he has a traditional understanding that salvation is only through the church.
And the more the United States did for Ukraine prior to 2022,
that
the more arms they shipped them, the more training they gave them, the more they de facto integrated them into NATO.
So
and the more likely it was Putin would feel threatened
West,
and would feel driven to invade. Any other leader of Russia
would
likely have the same motivation.
So we're not talking about the most stable people here. What is Nick Fuentes' history?
Just like any
working relationships, they don't seem to last a long time.
Being incentivized to try to win
what is Milo Yiannopoulos' history?
I think Germany had
working relationships that didn't seem to last a long time.
And that they didn't.
Not exactly sure about Kanye West's history, but it does seem to be quite a combustible, unpredictable, and difficult person.
Now, it's not that national leaders are completely irrelevant, right? No Hitler.
I'm going to put an over-under on a month. Maybe these guys will still be working together in a month.
Go to war.
So what's your over-under for how long these guys work together?
In Europe, but
Milo was
Hitler would have launched genocidal war against the Jews.
Being locked off YouTube. And he interned for Marjorie Taylor Greene. He's all over the map.
So I'm primarily a structuralist. I look at the structure of international relations, I look at the structure of situations, all of the personalities.
So if you take offense at Tim
sometimes the personality matters.
Then it may not be anything to do with Tim Pool, so you might just have a problem
Donald
with
Trump
reality.
Is a unique personality. Tim
Pool made some challenge to Kanye and just storms off. This is now
went around that island directly to the right.
Yeah, what Tim Pool did was not agree with
yesterday.
The Jewish question, and Kanye took offense.
So I see a lot of use of the term rift.
So,
deep left joke
what do you think the upside
is? A long video on what is
drifting.
drifting. It's by popular demand, and he says
you think this is
when you promise something good and it's fraudulent.
Strategy.
Well, drift does have a meaning.
Is this really the way forward?
It's small
the distant right in America.
So
get on board with Kanye.
I don't think any meaning beyond that is particularly useful. So as a put down,
some people just prone to drama,
impressive,
which makes them incredibly compelling live stream personalities. It makes them a lot of fun to be with.
Unless they're engaged in theft,
great entertainment at a party.
It's not grifting.
But you don't want them checking the engines before the plane takes off.
It's not fascist.
In fact,
fascism was a political movement that arose between World War I and World War II in Europe as a reaction.
Kanye strikes me as the type of bloke who will pull you into his whirlpool of dysfunction. Milo strikes me the type of bloke
as a meaning. That's where you take control of other countries. And Putin doesn't want to take control of all of Ukraine.
And I simply don't know enough about Nick Fuentes.
Evidenced by going
just
to
say he doesn't have a long
with only 175,000 soldiers, never shown any evidence of trying to take control of all of Ukraine. He wants to peel off a few promises, and he wants to provinces, and he wants to wreck Ukraine so that it will be less of a threat to Russia as a kind of launching base.
They're not people you want to build a life with. They're not people you want to organize with. Milo, Nick, Kanye didn't strike me as savvy political organizers.
I don't like it.
They strike me as self-obsessed, self-referential,
and they don't fit.
Attention-seeking,
and Peter Zion does
this. Types.
He gets in high dudgeon.
Have to work together.
He did this with January 6 protesters. He talked about them murdering policemen. And I know policemen who were murdered on January 6th.
So it was wonderful to be out in nature, to be out on the river. Just kind of puts everything in perspective.
It's
like looking up at the night sky and seeing the stars. That's something you can often do in Los Angeles because of all the smog.
The police.
But
so there are people who died on January 6th.
Get on the river. There's negative eons coming off the water.
Zion would talk about how the January 6th protesters, beat policemen to death.
wildlife, vegetation.
A lot of fun to listen to.
It's been here for thousands of years before you,
what makes them
go
so
on for
fun,
thousands of years after you. Kind of puts things in perspective.
So I can
And
describe
then
and
start thinking about hysterics, hysterical attention seekers,
really hard to be accurate.
like Kanye and Milo.
As good as stories. They're not going to be really
It just seems
dramatic.
amusing.
They're not going to be likely as compelling.
Some things make sense when
Seize
you're
your attention
home
as much.
alone
They're not going to be as
on your
entertaining.
computer hour after hour.
Some people feel
Going
constrain themselves
to whatever
by
place
story.
gives you the most stimulation, to whatever personality is the most entertaining and compelling. G'day, Tim Humphreys. How are you, mate?
That's all right.
I'm going to hit you up. I'll be up in Brisbane in a couple of weeks, at least for a few hours, so maybe I'll hit you up. So the type of people who are so entertaining and compelling and fun when you're home alone on your computer, but when you get outside, you get into God's nature, when you travel, when you see the water and the trees, right? They're no longer such a big deal. So some people wear well, like some people kind of awkward to get to know. They're laconic. So a lot of my friends are laconic. And they don't say a lot. But they wear really well. So with some of my friends, yeah, I do most of the talking, and I provide the drama, and I may provide most of the laughs, and they may not talk a lot, but they're just solid citizens. Like, they stick at their job for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 years. They stick at their marriages for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And they stick by their kids, stick by their communities, they stick by their families. So these laconic, low drama people, not the most exciting for a live stream, not the most compelling showbiz personalities, but they're just fair dinkum mates. So I don't know, or Kanye and Milo and Nick Fuentes, will they prove to be fair dinkum mates? Mateship's a wonderful quality. Right? So American men in particular are going through a dearth of friendship at the moment, according to surveys. Maybe they got something to learn from Australian values of mateship and this kind of me first, insane levels of self-promotion, not usually conducive to building friendships and community, or anything that lasts. And Parramatta, right? This is the big smoke in Sydney after downtown. Where you got the high rises, a concentration of energy and money. It's lower socioeconomic than the eastern suburbs. Still a lot of people, and this is where this ferry ride terminates. So woohoo, we're heading towards the Parramatta city centre. Have you ever spent a November in Parramatta? It's not to be missed, mate. Parramatta's just beautiful this time of year. How'd you like to live up there? Just overlooking all of beautiful Parramatta. Would you like Nick Fuentes as a neighbor, Kanye West as a neighbor, or Milo Yiannopoulos as a neighbor? So what are the temperatures here? The temperatures are about 70 degrees, so about 20 degrees Celsius, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Currumbung was great. So I walked all around Avondale College. I walked the track from our old home on Currans Road, walked the track, and then the bridge over the Dora Creek, right? It's hardly there anymore. The old tree that the bridge was built on was still there, but for about 8 feet it had to balance on approximately inch and a half width of wood. And luckily I managed to pull it off without falling in, carrying all my high-value electronic equipment. Thank you. Goodbye. So Avondale College looked in really prime shape as a Seventh-day Adventist college, and gorgeous squash courts. We got a brand new gym from when I was there last. Like, all the facilities look top rate. I went back to my old primary school where I went for 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And I need to tap off here. So hang on. G'day mate, 40 here. In magnificent Sydney Harbour. But I know what you're thinking about. Is New York City's child welfare system racist? Some of its own workers say yes. Well, most of New York City's child abuse workers are black. Most of their supervisors are black. But apparently black families in their system kill their children at 7 times the rate of other families. And somehow white racism must be to blame. Very disturbing.
Every day, the New York Times reads aloud a selection of stories.
Thank you.
I'm Andy Newman. I'm a reporter on the Metro desk, and I cover social services, which means homelessness, welfare, poverty, and things like that. This article that I'll be reading to you is about racial disparities in the child welfare system in New York City, where black families are 7 times as likely as white families to be accused of neglect or abuse. Black families have long contended that the system is biased against them. It turns out that many of the city's own caseworkers think so too, according to a survey the city commissioned. A.C.S. workers also said that for poor families, signs of poverty are often conflated with neglect, and that gets a lot of people put through these very intrusive child welfare investigations needlessly. I talked to one A.C.S. supervisor.
Very disturbing.
G'day mate, 40 here. Back on Sydney Harbour. Listening to this disturbing article in the New York Times. Is New York City's child welfare system racist? Some of its own workers say yes. So apparently black families 7 times more likely to be accused of child abuse. Must be white racism that's to blame. So most of the workers are black, but apparently this is a predatory system that specifically targets black and brown parents and subjects them to a different level of scrutiny. So it can't be anything wrong with the accused, right? It's not that they've done anything wrong, right? It must be with the racist system. So black families 7 times as likely as white families to be accused of child maltreatment, 13 times as likely to have their children removed. So race operates as an indicator of risk. So maybe not all groups, equally care for their kids, right? Maybe there's something going on with these particular families. So, apparently there are deep-seated problems affecting an agency that must balance protecting the safety of children and respecting the autonomy of families. Failure to detect signs of serious abuse can have tragic consequences. A series of fatal beatings last year in families known to the agencies demonstrated that families find child welfare investigations profoundly disruptive, humiliating, and even traumatic. So, poor families poured into the agency's orbit are overwhelmingly black and Latino. And symptoms of poverty are frequently punished as signs of neglect. So, poverty correlates with higher rates of neglect and abuse. So, the survey says black and brown parents are treated at every juncture as if they're not competent parents capable of providing acceptable care. Well, maybe some of them are not capable. Most of the workers are black, most of the supervisors are black, but somehow it must be white racism's fault. G'day mate, 40 here. So, as a white guy, I have no problem recognizing that often Asian parents put in more care, more devotion to their kids than white parents. So
poorly, but it would treat everybody poorly if it could. And it was
the New York
simply
Times.
the degree of pushback that ACS gets from families. What basically happens is that families who have money, no surprise, lawyer up, know that they don't have to cooperate quite as much as a lot of families do. And there are families who have been through.
Yeah, so apparently black kids are about 10 times more likely to be reported to Child Protective Services in New York City than white kids. I suspect that white kids are more likely to be reported than East Asian kids. Kids from, meaning Chinese American, Japanese American, Korean American families. Doesn't surprise me that different groups take different levels of care for their kids.
The system so many times for so long that they were just kind of resigned and they let ACS run roughshod over them. Gladys Carrion, the former ACS commissioner who I interviewed for this story, said that if ACS just took some of the money it spends on all of its programs and simply just gave it to families so that they could get a decent place to live, buy food, pay rent, that families would be a lot better off than they are now.
So I suspect there are a lot of poor families who don't abuse, beat, let alone kill their kids. So if you're beating your kids to a pulp, I don't think poverty is the issue here.
She said that the agency is not going to do that. For decades, black families have complained that the city's child welfare agency, the Administration for Children's Services, is biased against them. Turns out that many of the agency's own employees agree. According to a racial equity audit the agency commissioned but never publicly released.
Yeah, nothing like a good racial equity audit. I think we could all do with a racial equity audit in our lives. Think how much happier we'd be. Think about how much less racist we'd be. Think about how morally superior we'd be. Okay, mate, 40 here, back to this New York Times analysis. 83 child homicides from 2016 to 2022 found that black children in New York City were killed by family members at about 7 times the rate for white and Asian children, 3 times the rate for Hispanic children. Most the caseworkers in this story are black. Most of the leadership in the Division of Child Protection is black, and yet they're absolutely torturing themselves about how are they being racist. Pretty funny article.
The draft report, based on a 2020 survey of more than 50 black and Hispanic front frontline caseworkers and agency managers in Brooklyn and the Bronx, along with many parents and advocates, described a predatory system that specifically targets black and brown parents and subjects them to a different level of scrutiny. In New York's child welfare system, where black families are 7 times as likely as white families to be accused of maltreatment and 13 times as likely to have their children removed.
Okay, so maybe it's not the agency, maybe it's not their procedures, maybe there's a problem in certain segments of this community that's contributing this astronomical rate of killing and abuse. Okay, mate, 40 here. So the John Howard government in Australia around 2006 investigated what was going on in the child abuse problem in Aboriginal communities. And upon investigation, they found that some Aboriginal communities, every single child had been sexually molested. All right? So we hear a lot about sexual abuse problems in the Roman Catholic Church, but problems even greater in large swaths of the Aboriginal community and in parts of the African American community, but that doesn't get nearly as much attention. And it's a lot more palatable to go after the Roman Catholic Church than to go after communities of color. So one way that Australia and Canada and other nations have traditionally dealt with the astronomical rates of child abuse is to take these children away from abusive homes. But now that's gotten a bad name. Now that's called the stolen generation, that these kids were stolen. Okay, so you're stealing kids away from being abused. So there's an astronomical problem in parts of the Aboriginal community, parts of the African American community with murdering kids and abusing kids, like at a rate far in excess of what happens to Roman Catholics.
Race operates as an indicator of risk, the report concluded.
This is New York Times,
The survey
race
laid out
order,
deep-seated problems,
racial equity order.
afflicting an agency that must balance protecting the safety of children and respecting the autonomy of families. A failure to detect signs of serious abuse can have tragic consequences, as a series of fatal beatings last year in families known to A.C.S. demonstrated. But families find child welfare investigations profoundly disruptive, humiliating, and even traumatic. Casework.
Well, maybe don't abuse your kids, don't beat your kids. Maybe, treat your kids with respect, and you won't have to deal with the child protection services. That's the thought.
Workers making unannounced visits, strip search children looking for bruises, and peer into refrigerators and around homes, looking for signs of bad parenting. One A.C.S. worker in the survey compared the experience to being stopped and frisked for 60 days. For poor families pulled into A.C.S.'s orbit, who are overwhelmingly Black and Latino, symptoms of poverty are frequently punished as signs of neglect, the survey found. Because poverty is correlated with higher rates of neglect and abuse, it is difficult to say how much the disparities in the system can be directly linked to income or to race. But according to the survey, A.C.S. workers and other participants said that rather than starting from a presumption of innocence, Black and brown parents are treated at every juncture as if they are not competent parents capable of providing acceptable care to their children. Caseworkers said they felt pressured to push their way into people's homes and not tell parents their rights. They feel complicit in the harm that A.C.S. can cause Black and brown families and powerless to change the system.
Okay, so most of the caseworkers are Black, most of the supervisors are Black, but somehow it's white racism that's to blame for all this.
The report stated, most A.C.S. caseworkers are Black, as is most leadership in the agency's Division of Child Protection, the agency said. Among the reforms recommended...
So maybe the agency isn't terribly competent. Maybe there's a competency problem. And the addition to an abuse problem, in addition to a killing children problem here.
By staff members in the survey was a Miranda warning law requiring that parents be immediately informed of their rights not to speak to caseworkers and not to let them in without a court order, and to consult a lawyer. ACS has opposed such measures, arguing that they would make it harder for caseworkers to immediately assess whether children are safe. The draft report was obtained from the city via a Freedom of Information request by the Bronx Defenders, a
G'day mate, 40 here on the way to Parramatta listening to the New York Times.
Profit that represents parents in family court. The report, prepared by a consulting firm that helped governments design more racially equitable systems, was based in part on conversations with ACS workers.
Okay, more racially equitable systems, as though from the outset, the idea that different groups might have different life results, different criminal tendencies, different earning tendencies, different education tendencies, different abuse tendencies, and different attitudes towards children, different commitments to raising children, right? The idea that different groups might have different gifts, right? That's just dismissed from the outset. That's why we need these racial equality reports.
Chose to participate rather than on a quantitative survey. The report, said Joyce McMillan, Executive Director of JMAC for Families, which advocates for families with ACS cases, reveals an agency targeting certain demographics using tactics based on surveillance and not the actual protecting of a child.
Okay, so it's the agency's fault. They're just going after certain demographics. It's not that certain demographics commit disproportionate rates of crime and child abuse, have different values with regard to raising children, right? In Australian Aboriginal communities, all right, child abuse rates frequently range from 50% to 100%. So just as Roman Catholic churches seem to have a disproportionate rate among the Christian denominations of child abuse, so too other groups have disproportionate rates. So somewhere around here we're going to go from Sydney Harbour to the Parramatta River. Listening to the New York Times.
She said, the report also tells us that their own workers are not comfortable doing this stuff and that they feel choked into submission. The survey comes to light amid a flurry of reports criticizing New York's child welfare systems. The State Bar Association recently declared the state's system plagued by racism. Human Rights Watch and the American Civil Liberties Union released a report in late November concluding that in New York and several other states, black children are needlessly separated from their families. Now, the New York Advisory Committee.
Yeah, I bet they are needlessly separated because those families aren't particularly good families. They're often horrific families, abusive families. So what about holding people responsible for their own choices? What about holding groups responsible for their own outcomes? Or are they just helpless, helpless victims of white supremacy? Is that what we're going to do? We're going to blame all behavior that's troubling by non-whites. We're just going to blame that on white people. G'day mate, 40 here, listening to the New York Times in Sydney Harbour.
The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is investigating whether child welfare authorities in the state violate black families' constitutional rights. The first hearing in the inquiry was held on November 8th.
Yeah, it must really be primarily about constitutional rights. Couldn't possibly about excessive rates of bad behavior in certain communities. It must be our system. Why is our system so racist as to find disproportionate results among different groups? Gosh.
Much of the racial disparity in into the child welfare system is outside ACS's control. It must investigate every allegation that meets definitions of abuse or neglect.
Maybe we just need to change our definition of abuse so that there are fewer investigations, right? So that more of these fine families don't get disrupted and investigated for just totally ticky-tacky reasons.
Such reports can be made by anyone. 2/3 are eventually deemed unfounded. Last year, 1 in 15 black children in the city was the subject of a maltreatment investigation. Only 1 in 111 white children was. ACS declined to answer questions about the report.
And the only explanation for this disparity is systemic racism, structural racism, white supremacy. No other possible explanation. Okay, May 40 here. So there are various indigenous communities, whether in Alaska or Australia or Canada or elsewhere in the world, where rates of child abuse are way above 50%, even up to 100%. And so what's the common denominator here? Is it because there's a Roman Catholic priest, or is it that certain communities are just much more abusive than other communities? Some communities take much better care of their children than other communities. Maybe whether or not there are Christians in the community or priests in the community isn't the major factor in figuring out the rate of child abuse.
When its commissioner, Jess Danhauser, said in a statement that the agency continued to work to address racial inequities that have existed in child welfare for too long. ACS is focused every day on achieving safety and equity, he said. While many have suggested it must be one or the other, he believes they can only be accomplished together.
I don't know about you, but for me, equity is just so much more important than safety. Let us have an astronomical crime rate, an astronomical rate of abuse of kids, but as long as there's equity, right? That's the most important thing.
We will continue to put policies and initiatives in place that aim to keep children safe while reducing unnecessary ACS abuse. Racial disparity in child welfare is intertwined with economic and societal factors putting pressure on families, experts and research suggest. Maltreatment rates are 5 times higher for lower-income children, according to federal statistics. And black New Yorkers are nearly twice as likely as white residents to live in poverty. Statewide data underscore the connection. Racial disparities in child welfare involvement and the income gap between black and white are both much larger in New York City than in the rest of the state. Stress is at the root of the relationship between poverty and child neglect and abuse, said Melissa Merrick, president of Prevent Child Abuse.
Yeah, stress or bad character or certain culturally developed patterns of abuse towards kids, right? You go to school, you see kids from certain homes tend to work a lot harder. So James Flynn, the psychologist, developer of the Flynn effect, was a visiting professor in Virginia, United States for a year, and on his cul-de-sac there was a Jewish family, and after dinner the family would all yell at each other, and then the kids would settle down and do homework. So all 3 of these families are professionals. The Asian kids were quiet, they would just settle down to do homework after dinner, and then the black family after dinner, they would go outside and play basketball, right? So different groups tend to have different cultural practices and tend to be skilled, particularly skilled, disproportionately skilled at different things. So here's the New York Times article.
America, an advocacy group. If you can't pay your rent or you childcare, she said, all of these things may put you on edge and maybe make you not be able to bring your best parenting self to the job of parenting.
Yeah, that's likely.
Dr. Merrick said that conditions including racial bias, disinvestment in communities of color, and lack of access to support systems all drive disparities in.
Yeah, that must be the reason why there are these racial disparities in child killing and child abuse in New York cities. It's that lack of investment in communities of color. Sure, that's it.
Abuse. But black families in New York City are also more likely than Hispanic and Asian families to be accused of neglect or abuse or to have their children removed, even though Hispanic and Asian families have higher poverty rates. A New York Times analysis of 83 child homicides from 2016 to 2022 found that black children in the city were killed in cases where family members were charged at about 7 times the rate for white and Asian children and 3 times the rate for Hispanic children. Several black parents with recent A.C.S. cases said in interviews that they felt they would have been treated differently if they were white. I think A.C.S.'s goal was to prove abuse, said Mylana Gerard, 25, who lost the right to be alone with her infant son for nearly a year after he was found to have 16 fractured ribs. Even after she gave A.C.S. records from a special...
Yeah, the kid had 16 fractured ribs for completely ordinary reasons. It wasn't that she was a neglectful mother. Man, just imagine she was blocked from seeing a kid for a year just because a kid was found to have 16 fractured ribs.
Stating that the fractures were probably caused by a genetic variant, the agency waited 5 months before clearing her. Ms. Gerard, who works for a nonprofit and lives in the South Bronx, said she believed that if she were white and richer, A.C.S. would have tried harder to find out what was going on with my son. Disparities in the child welfare system persist in New York City, even as the overall number of children removed and placed in foster care continues to fall, from 40,000 in the late 90s to 14,000 a decade ago to under 7,000.
Yeah, so it used to be that you took kids away from abusive situations, just like you put crazy, ranting homeless people in insane asylums. Now we've emptied out the insane asylums. We're leaving kids in abusive homes. And are we really better off? I mean, was the stolen generation really worse off being removed from frequently abusive situations and given an education and the ability to build an honorable life? Maybe the rabbit-proof fence, name of a famous Australian movie about the stolen generation of half Aboriginal, half white kids who were taken from their frequently abusive Indigenous families and raised as good Australians, given the ability to read and write, given job skills, given discipline, right? Raise them in the environment much more suited for their thriving. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. That's what we're doing now. The more we're putting these kids in the hands of social workers and schools and feeding them at schools and having them spend as little time at home in the ghetto with their parents, right? That's essentially the same thing as what was castigated for in rabbit-proof fence and the stolen generation.
G'day mate, 40 here. Fascinating article in the New Yorker how hospice became a for-profit hustle.
$1,000 Rolls Royce that was later confiscated by the government. Nelson, who was convicted earlier this year of 7 counts of healthcare fraud, told me that he'd fallen victim to greedy hospice entrepreneurs who had done hundreds of third-grader level forgeries of his signature when racking up illegal enrollments, and that he'd assumed other forms he'd signed were truthful. Nelson awaits sentencing and has filed a motion challenging the verdict. The Mississippi Delta has an acute shortage of primary care providers, a problem that contributes to the region's poor health outcomes. When I visited some of the fraud victims in the case, all of whom were Black, they told me that the experience of being duped had deepened their mistrust of a healthcare system that already seemed out of reach.
Yeah, if you're low IQ, right, you're going to be duped a lot, right?
Some of the patients Nelson had approved for hospice were in their 40s and 50s. One had cognitive disabilities, and another couldn't read. Marjorie and Jimmy Brown, former high school sweethearts in their 70s.
Yeah, so this for-profit hospice industry, they're doping people up with opioids and killing them off early to turn a profit. And this is a New York Times article on, is New York's child welfare system racist? Some of its own workers say yes. Keep in mind, most of the workers and most of the supervisors here are Black.
My son. Disparities in the child welfare system persist in New York City, even as the overall number of children removed and placed in foster care continues to fall, from 40,000 in the late 90s to 14,000 a decade ago, to under 7,000 today. Once Black families are in the system, the outcomes of their cases are more likely to be severe. As this year began, 4,300 Black children were in foster care, about 1 in 90, while only 406 white children were, about 1 in 1,100.
Wow, so it sounds like there's a problem in part of the African American community with parenting. Or maybe it's white racism. Can't quite figure it out.
The racial gap has also defied years of attempts by ACS to close it. ACS has had an Office of Equity Strategies since 2017.
Great.
It has a Racial Equity and Cultural Competence Committee and an Equity Action Plan. It requires implicit bias training for staff. It assigns a growing percentage of its caseload to a non-investigative track that connects families to the help they need. ACS supported legislation that raised the evidence threshold for substantiating abuse reports and that required bias training for mandated reporters of abuse, including teachers and medical workers. Gladys Carrion, ACS's commissioner from 2014 to 2016, said that the challenges the agency faced were universal and enormous. There is no child welfare system in the U.S. that stands out as being able to have effectively dealt with the issue of disparity, she said. To
Wow.
ACS's credit,
So it sounds like different groups might have different commitments and different abilities with parenting.
they've tried a bunch of things, maybe more than other jurisdictions, and none of them has moved the needle. She added that the agency faced the impossible task of keeping every child safe without over-policing families. This is the only place which has a standard that you can never make a mistake, she said. In October 2020, while the study conducted by the National Innovation Service was underway, ACS's then Commissioner David Hansel touted it to the City Council. We must listen even when it is difficult, he said. And we must look critically at our own attitudes, even when it is painful. In the survey, many ACS workers focused on how allegations of neglect, a broad category that includes inadequate guardianship, food, clothing.
Yeah, we have astronomically increased the definition of abuse. Right? There was no such category of child abuse prior to the 1960s, and ever since then we keep maximizing the definition of abuse to anything that is short of encouraging human flourishing.
Or shelter, and accounts for 2/3 of all maltreatment reports, are used to sweep poor families into the system. Mandated reporters, ACS workers complained, often file reports that describe conditions indicating poverty but not neglect. Teachers make reports based on the cleanliness.
Yeah, so many of these parents say, oh, can't afford to feed my kids. Like it costs a couple of dollars to make a decent breakfast. Come on, man.
child's clothing or whether they bring food to school.
Here comes my ferry.
Caseworkers said they spent so much time chasing unfounded neglect claims that it became harder for them to protect children from abuse. They suggested the agency push lawmakers for clearer neglect standards. Emma Ketteringham, who heads the Bronx Defenders Family Practice and participated in the survey, said that nothing appeared to have changed at ACS since the report. The bigger picture here, Ms. Ketteringham said, is that we have ACS publicly committing to be an anti-racist organization and then not even sharing the findings publicly, let alone implementing them. Angel Charles, a 37-year-old travel nurse, thought her dealings with ACS were behind her. Ms. Charles, who herself experienced sexual and physical abuse, had 3 children removed for abuse and neglect in her early 20s.
And she did nothing wrong.
After her 3-year-old son burned himself on a radiator, she allowed her children to miss school, and she kept an unsanitary apartment, her lawyer said.
She's the victim here.